The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Morrison adjusted his red tunic and checked his watch. 23 years of service in the Queen's Guard had taught him that precision was everything. Every button polished, every movement calculated, every emotion buried beneath layers of discipline and duty. At 45, James had seen 3 monarchs, countless ceremonies, and thousands of tourists who tried desperately to make him smile, laugh, or even blink. He had become a master of stillness, a living statue in service to the crown. The tourists were already gathering behind the iron gates, cameras ready, hoping to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. James positioned himself at his post near the main entrance, his bearskin hat adding 8 inches to his already impressive 6-foot frame. The familiar weight of his rifle felt comforting in his hands as he assumed the position he had held countless times before. Eyes forward, jaw set, breathing controlled. This was his world, predictable and ordered. Among the crowd, 8-year-old Lucy Chin clutched her mother's hand tightly. The small family had traveled from Manchester for what her parents called a proper London adventure. Lucy's father, David, was a factory worker who had saved for months to afford this trip. Her mother, Sarah, worked nights as a cleaner to help make ends meet. For them, this vacation represented a rare moment of joy in an otherwise challenging year. Lucy had been born with a severe speech impediment that made communication difficult. Despite years of therapy, she could only manage a few words, and even those came out unclear and hesitant. At school, other children often ignored her or worse, mocked her attempts to speak. She had learned to express herself through drawings, gestures, and the expressive brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond her years. As the family approached the palace gates, Lucy's attention was immediately drawn to the imposing figure of Captain Morrison. Unlike the other guards she had seen, there was something about his presence that felt different. Perhaps it was the way he held himself, with a dignity that transcended mere duty, or maybe it was something she sensed rather than saw. While her parents busied themselves with taking photographs and reading the historical plaques, Lucy found herself studying the guard's face. James noticed the little girl immediately, though his training prevented any outward acknowledgement. In his peripheral vision, he could see her standing apart from the crowd, not trying to get his attention like the others, but simply watching. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something that penetrated the armor of indifference he had spent years constructing. Most children grew bored after a few minutes of watching the motionless guards, but this girl remained patient and observant. The Chen family had planned to spend only an hour at the palace before moving on to the Tower of London, but Lucy seemed reluctant to leave. When her parents called her name, she would take a few steps toward them, then drift back toward the guard. Sarah noticed her daughter's unusual behavior but attributed it to the excitement of seeing the famous guards she had heard so much about. "Lucy, sweetheart, we need to go," Sarah called gently. "We have so much more to see today." Lucy looked at her mother, then back at the guard. Something was happening in her mind, a connection forming that she couldn't quite understand or explain. In her limited vocabulary, she had no words for what she was feeling, but her instincts told her that this man, the stranger in the red coat, was important somehow. James continued his watch, but found his concentration wavering. The little girl's persistent presence was unusual, and, despite his best efforts to maintain professional detachment, he found himself genuinely curious about her. Most children who lingered near the guards were seeking attention or entertainment, but this girl seemed to be searching for something else entirely. As the morning progressed, other tourists came and went, taking their photographs and moving on with their itineraries. The Chen family eventually left with the crowd, but not before Lucy turned back one last time to look at Captain Morrison. Their eyes met for just a moment, and James felt something shift inside him, a crack in the foundation of his professional composure. The rest of James's shift passed without incident, but he found his thoughts returning to the little girl throughout the day. There had been something in her eyes, a kind of recognition or need that he couldn't quite place. He told himself it was nothing, just another tourist interaction that would be forgotten by evening. But, as he changed out of his uniform at the end of his shift, he realized the encounter had affected him more than he cared to admit. That evening, James returned to his small flat in South London, a modest space that reflected his solitary lifestyle. He had never married, never had children of his own. His life had been dedicated entirely to his service, and he had convinced himself that this was enough. But something about the day's events left him feeling unsettled and restless. Meanwhile, the Chin family was experiencing their own form of restlessness. Back in their hotel room, Lucy was unusually quiet, even for a child who struggled with verbal communication. She sat by the window, drawing in the sketchbook her mother had bought for the trip. Sarah glanced over at her daughter's artwork and was surprised to see detailed drawings of the guard they had seen that morning. "She's drawn him 5 times now," David observed, sitting beside his wife on the small hotel bed. "I've never seen her so focused on anything before." Sarah studied her daughter's drawings more closely. Each one captured not just the guard's appearance, but something deeper. There was emotion in these sketches, a sensitivity that went beyond mere observation. Lucy had somehow seen past the uniform and ceremony to something more human underneath. "Maybe we should go back tomorrow," Sarah suggested. She seemed really interested in the palace. David nodded, though he was thinking about their budget. They had planned to visit the British Museum the next day, which was free, rather than returning to the expensive tourist area around the palace. But seeing his daughter's engagement with something, anything, felt important enough to justify the extra expense. The next morning found Captain Morrison back at his post, going through the same routine he had followed for over 2 decades. The weather was typical for London in October, grey and cool with the promise of rain. He positioned himself with military precision, settled into his stance, and prepared for another day of ceremonial duty. When the Chen family appeared in the crowd again, James felt a strange sense of anticipation. The little girl was back, wearing a different outfit but carrying the same watchful intensity. This time, she approached the gate more directly, positioning herself where she would have the clearest view of the guard. Lucy had spent much of the previous evening thinking about the man in the red coat. In her 8-year-old mind, she had constructed an entire narrative about who he might be and why he stood so still and serious. She imagined he must be very important, responsible for protecting something precious. But she also sensed something else about him, something that reminded her of how she felt when other children ignored her or when adults spoke about her as if she weren't there. For the first hour, the pattern from the previous day repeated itself. Lucy watched, James maintained his position, and the crowd of tourists flowed around them both. But then, something unexpected happened. A group of teenage boys, emboldened by their friends and armed with smartphones, began trying increasingly aggressive tactics to get reactions from the guard. "Look at this robot," one of them shouted, stepping closer to the rope barrier. "I bet he's not even real." The boys began making faces and gestures, filming themselves as they tried to provoke a response. James remained motionless, his training taking over completely. He had dealt with far worse over the years, and these teenagers represented nothing more than a minor annoyance. But Lucy saw something different. While the other tourists laughed or ignored the boy's behavior, she recognized something in the guard's stillness that others missed. It wasn't just professional discipline, there was something vulnerable underneath, something that was being hurt by the mockery even if he couldn't show it. Without fully understanding what she was doing or why, Lucy approached the rope barrier. She couldn't speak to defend the guard, couldn't shout at the boys to stop their harassment. But she could do something else. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small piece of paper from her sketchbook. On it was a simple drawing she had made the night before, a picture of the guard not in his uniform, but as she imagined him when he was just a regular person, sitting in a garden with a cup of tea and a small smile on his face. Lucy folded the paper carefully and, when no one was looking, slipped it through the gap in the iron railings. The paper landed near James's feet, close enough that he could see it without moving his head. The drawing was simple, done in colored pencils with the careful attention only a child could give to something that mattered to them. James saw the paper fall and, in a moment of perfect stillness, read the message it contained. It wasn't words that the little girl had used to communicate with him, but something far more powerful. In her innocent artwork, she had seen him not as a symbol or a tourist attraction, but as a person. Someone worthy of kindness and respect. The teenage boys eventually lost interest and moved on, but Lucy remained. She looked up at James with eyes that seemed to hold an understanding far beyond her years, and, in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Without breaking protocol, without moving a muscle, James felt the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crack. The silent communication between the guard and the little girl continued for several more minutes. Other tourists passed by, taking their pictures and moving on, but neither James nor Lucy noticed. They had found something in each other that neither had expected to find, a connection that transcended the barriers of duty, age, and circumstance. When the Chen family finally left that day, Lucy waved goodbye with a smile that lit up her entire face. James, still maintaining his perfect stillness, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, his duty felt like something more than mere obligation. It felt like an honor worthy of the trust a little girl had placed in him. That evening, James Morrison sat in his Spartan flat, staring at the small piece of paper he had carefully retrieved after his shift ended. The child's drawing lay on his kitchen table like a foreign object, something that didn't belong in his ordered, solitary world. He had broken protocol by picking it up, a minor infraction that could technically result in disciplinary action if discovered. But, as he studied the simple artwork, he realized he didn't care about the rules for the first time in his adult life. The drawing showed remarkable detail for a child's work. She had captured not just his physical appearance but somehow sensed something deeper about who he was beneath the uniform. The version of himself in the drawing looked peaceful, content in a way he couldn't remember ever feeling. It was as if this little girl had seen through 23 years of military conditioning to glimpse the man he might have been under different circumstances. James had joined the army at 18, straight out of a troubled childhood in Birmingham. His father had been absent, his mother overwhelmed by poverty and mental health struggles. The military had offered structure, purpose, and escape from a life that seemed to offer no other options. He had excelled in the discipline and order of military life, finding in the rigid hierarchy something he had never experienced at home. The transition to the Queen's Guard had been the pinnacle of his career. Selected for his exemplary record and unwavering discipline, he had embraced the role with complete dedication. The ceremonial nature of the position suited his temperament perfectly. There were clear rules, established protocols, and no ambiguity about what was expected of him. He could disappear entirely into the role, becoming a symbol rather than a person. But, now, holding this child's drawing, James found himself questioning the walls he had built around his emotions. The little girl had somehow reached through his defenses with nothing more than colored pencils and innocent perception. She had seen him as worthy of kindness, worthy of protection from the mockery of strangers. When was the last time anyone had seen him that way? Meanwhile, 3 miles away in their hotel room, the Chen family was dealing with their own emotional revelations. Lucy had been more animated since their return from the palace, using gestures and her limited vocabulary to try to communicate something important to her parents. She kept pointing at her drawings and, then, toward the window, as if trying to explain a connection they couldn't understand. Sarah Chen watched her daughter with growing concern and fascination. In 8 years of parenting a child with severe communication difficulties, she had learned to read Lucy's nonverbal cues with remarkable accuracy. But, this evening, her daughter was trying to convey something that seemed beyond her usual range of expression. "She's trying to tell us something about the guard," David observed, joining his wife on the edge of the bed. "Look how she keeps pointing at the drawings." Lucy nodded enthusiastically when she heard her father mention the guard. She picked up her newest drawing, one she had completed while they were having dinner. This one was different from the others. Instead of showing the guard in his uniform or in peaceful settings, this drawing depicted 2 figures standing together. One was clearly meant to be Lucy herself, small and hesitant. The other was the guard, but he was kneeling down to her level, his hand extended in a gesture of friendship. "I think she wants to be his friend," Sarah said softly, studying the drawing. "But, sweetheart, you know that's not how it works. The guards have important jobs. They can't talk to visitors." Lucy's face fell at her mother's explanation, but the determination in her eyes didn't fade. She pointed at the drawing again, then at herself, then made a gesture that her parents had learned meant help. Someone needed help, but they couldn't understand who or why. The next morning brought unexpected complications for both the Morrison and Chen families. James arrived at the palace to find his commanding officer, Major Richardson, waiting for him with a stern expression. "Morrison, a word," the major said curtly, leading him away from the other guards. James felt his stomach tighten. Had someone reported his interaction with the child's drawing? Had he been observed breaking protocol? "There's been a complaint," Major Richardson continued. "Yesterday, a group of teenagers posted videos online showing them harassing guards at various posts. In one of the videos, there appears to be a small girl who approached your position. The footage is unclear, but it looks like she may have made contact with you." James kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. "Sir, I maintained my position throughout my shift. I did not acknowledge or interact with any visitors." "I'm sure you didn't," the major said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But these social media incidents are becoming a problem. The palace is under scrutiny about public access and security. We need to be extra vigilant about maintaining proper distance from civilians." The implication was clear. James was being warned to be more careful, more distant. Any further incidents could result in serious consequences for his career. As he took his position that morning, James felt the weight of official disapproval settling over him like a heavy coat. When the Chen family arrived at the palace for the third consecutive day, James saw them with different eyes. The little girl who had seemed like a bright spot in his routine now represented a potential threat to everything he had built his life around. He forced himself to look past her, to treat her like any other tourist. But Lucy was not easily deterred. She had spent another evening thinking about the serious man in the red coat, and her 8-year-old intuition told her that something was wrong. Yesterday, she had felt a connection, a moment of understanding between them. Today, that connection felt blocked, as if a wall had been rebuilt overnight. The morning crowd was larger than usual, and among the tourists was a group of reporters who had come to investigate the viral videos from the previous day. They were interviewing visitors about their experiences with the guards, asking leading questions about whether the ceremonial soldiers were too rigid, too unfriendly, too removed from the people they were meant to serve. Lucy watched the reporters with growing distress. She couldn't understand their words, but she could sense their critical tone. They were talking about her guard, and they didn't seem to be saying nice things. Her protective instincts, already heightened by her own experiences with bullying, flared into action. One of the reporters, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled hair and an expensive camera crew, approached the barrier near James's position. "Can you tell us what you think about these guards?" she asked a nearby tourist. "Do you think they're too intimidating for families with children?" The question struck Lucy like a physical blow. Intimidating? Her guard wasn't intimidating. He was kind and patient and deserving of respect. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in the careful way he had noticed her drawing. These people didn't understand anything about him. Without thinking, Lucy broke away from her parents and approached the reporter. Using the few clear words she could manage, she said loudly, "Nice man. Good man." The reporter turned to Lucy with professional interest, seeing an opportunity for a compelling soundbite. "Oh, hello there, sweetheart. Are you talking about the guard? Do you think he's nice?" Lucy nodded vigorously, then pointed at James. "Help," she said, one of her clearest words. "He help." The reporter exchanged glances with her cameraman. This could be perfect footage, a child defending the guards against criticism. "Can you tell us how he helped you, sweetheart?" But Lucy's limited vocabulary couldn't convey the complex emotional support she had received. She grew frustrated, tears forming in her eyes as she struggled to find words that didn't exist in her limited repertoire. The more the reporter pressed, the more agitated Lucy became. James watched the scene unfolding with growing alarm. The little girl was clearly distressed, and the reporter was exploiting her communication difficulties for dramatic effect. Every instinct he had developed as a protector and soldier told him to intervene, but his training and the morning's warning held him in place. Saracen finally noticed what was happening and rushed over to collect her daughter. "I'm sorry," she said to the reporter.
Lucy has special needs. She gets overwhelmed easily. But the damage was done.
Lucy was crying now, frustrated by her inability to defend someone she had come to care about. The reporter had her footage, a touching but ultimately exploitative segment about a disabled child's connection to the stoic guards. As Sarah led Lucy away, the little girl looked back at James with eyes full of confusion and hurt. She had tried to help him, tried to tell people that he was good and kind, but the words wouldn't come. In that moment, James felt something break inside his chest. This child had recognized something in him that he had almost forgotten existed, and he had been powerless to protect her from the very situation his presence had created. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of self-recrimination and mounting resolve. When Major Richardson appeared again at the end of the day, James was prepared for the worst. "That incident this morning," the Major began. "It's exactly the kind of situation we need to avoid. The reporter has already contacted the press office asking about the girl's claims that you helped her." "Sir, I never broke protocol," James replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "I know you didn't," Richardson said more gently. "But perception matters as much as reality in this job. The palace is considering implementing stricter barriers, more distance between the guards and the public. Incidents like this morning's are being used as justification." James nodded, understanding the implications. His career would survive, but the cost would be higher walls, greater separation from the very people they were meant to serve. The little girl's innocent attempt to defend him would result in making future connections even more impossible. That evening, James sat in his flat with the child's drawing spread before him on the table. He had reached a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. For 23 years, he had hidden behind duty and protocol, using his service as an excuse to avoid the messy complications of human connection. But this little girl had shown him what he was missing, what he was protecting himself from experiencing. The rules that governed his life were meant to preserve order and dignity, but they were also preventing him from being the kind of person this child had seen in him. Tomorrow would bring another day of ceremonial duty, another opportunity to choose between the safety of isolation and the risk of genuine human connection. As he carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his wallet, James realized that some rules were worth breaking, especially when breaking them meant honoring the trust of someone who had seen the best in him when he had forgotten it existed himself. The little girl's silent plea had reached him, and his reaction would indeed break every rule he had lived by for decades. The only question now was whether he had the courage to follow through. The fourth morning arrived with an unusual weight of anticipation for James Morrison. He had barely slept, spending most of the night walking the streets of London, wrestling with a decision that could end his career and transform his life. The drawing in his wallet felt like a talisman, a reminder of what he had discovered about himself in the eyes of a little girl who couldn't speak but somehow communicated more clearly than anyone he had ever met. As he donned his uniform that morning, James looked at himself in the mirror with different eyes. The red tunic, the bearskin hat, the polished brass buttons, they were all the same as they had been for 23 years. But the man wearing them had changed fundamentally. The little girl had shown him that duty without humanity was merely performance, and performance without heart was just an elaborate form of hiding. Major Richardson had made it clear that any further incidents would result in serious consequences. The palace administration was already drafting new protocols that would increase the distance between guards and the public. The viral videos and reporter's story had created exactly the kind of controversy the institution wanted to avoid. James understood that he was being watched more closely than ever before. The Chen family's last day in London had arrived with bittersweet awareness for all of them. David had checked their bank account that morning and confirmed what they all knew: their modest savings were exhausted. They could afford one final visit to the palace before catching their afternoon train back to Manchester. For Sarah, it meant saying goodbye to the first place where Lucy had shown sustained interest in anything for months. For Lucy, it meant leaving behind something she couldn't articulate but felt deeply. Lucy had spent the previous evening creating what she somehow knew would be her final drawing for the guard. This one was different from all the others, more complex and emotionally sophisticated. It showed the guard standing in his usual position, but surrounding him were dozens of small figures, children and adults alike, all looking at him with expressions of gratitude and respect. At the bottom of the page, in her careful childish handwriting, she had managed to spell out a single word: friend. When the family arrived at the palace, the morning crowd was smaller than usual. The controversy from the previous day seemed to have affected attendance, with many tourists choosing other attractions to avoid potential complications. James took his position with mechanical precision, but his awareness of the little girl's presence was immediate and acute. Lucy approached the barrier with unusual solemnity for an 8-year-old. She could sense that this visit was different, that something important was happening that she didn't fully understand but felt with every fiber of her being. Her parents hung back slightly, giving her space while keeping her within sight. For the first hour, the familiar pattern repeated itself. Lucy watched, James maintained his position, and the sparse crowd moved around them. But, as the morning progressed, James became increasingly aware of conversations happening around him. Tourists were discussing the previous day's news story, debating whether the guards were too distant, whether the traditions were outdated, whether real people existed beneath the ceremonial uniforms. A group of elderly visitors paused near his position, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. "It's all just for show, isn't it?" one of them said. "They're like wax figures, not real soldiers." "Bit unfriendly, if you ask me," another added. "In my day, a man in uniform would at least acknowledge a polite greeting." James had heard similar comments thousands of times over the years, and they had never affected him. But, today, with the little girl's drawing burning like a flame in his wallet, the words struck him differently. He found himself thinking about the difference between respect earned through fear and distance versus respect earned through genuine human connection. Lucy seemed to sense the tension in the air around the guard. Her 8-year-old intuition, sharpened by years of navigating a world that often ignored or dismissed her, picked up on the subtle signs of distress that others missed. The guard's stillness today felt different, more brittle, as if he were holding himself together through sheer force of will. As the morning progressed, another group of teenagers approached, clearly inspired by the viral videos from previous days. They were more aggressive than the earlier group, emboldened by the online attention their predecessors had received. They began their harassment with crude jokes and gestures, but quickly escalated to more serious provocations. "Look at this toy soldier," one of them shouted, pulling out his phone to film. "I bet we can make him move if we try hard enough." They began throwing small objects, coins and bits of paper, aiming for James's feet. Other tourists started to back away, sensing the escalating tension. James remained motionless, his training taking over completely, but Lucy could see something that the others missed. Behind the guard's professional composure, she sensed real pain, real vulnerability, being attacked by people who saw him as less than human. The harassment continued for several more minutes, with the teenagers growing bolder and more aggressive. Other tourists began to murmur disapprovingly, but no one intervened. The situation was spiraling towards something that would undoubtedly result in official consequences for everyone involved. And then, in a moment that would change everything, Lucy did something that broke every rule of palace protocol and tourist behavior. She ducked under the rope barrier. The action was so unexpected, so completely unprecedented, that even the harassing teenagers stopped to stare. Lucy walked directly to James's position, her small figure dwarfed by his imposing presence. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her final drawing, the one showing the guard surrounded by people who saw him as a friend. Looking up at James with eyes that held all the trust and innocent faith an 8-year-old could muster, Lucy pressed the drawing against his leg and said, in the clearest voice she had managed all week, "You are good. You are my friend." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge to everyone who had ever seen the guards as mere tourist attractions. In that moment, James felt 23 years of careful emotional control crumbling around him. This little girl, who struggled every day to make herself understood, had risked everything to defend him, to see him as a person worthy of friendship and protection. The crowd had fallen completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The teenagers with their phones lowered them, suddenly, ashamed of their behavior when confronted with the contrast of a disabled child showing more courage and compassion than any of them had displayed.
James looked down at Lucy, his professional facade finally, irreversibly cracking. In violation of every regulation he had sworn to uphold, he slowly, deliberately, reached out and gently touched the top of her head. The gesture was small, barely perceptible, but it contained within it a recognition of her humanity, her courage, and her gift of seeing him as more than his uniform. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice so quiet that only Lucy could hear it. But those two words carried the weight of decades of unexpressed gratitude, loneliness, and hope. The moment stretched between them, guard and child, two people who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were looking for. Around them, the crowd began to understand that they were witnessing not a breach of protocol, but an act of profound human connection that transcended rules and regulations. Security personnel were already moving toward the scene, and James knew that his career as a Queen's Guard was effectively over. Major Richardson would have no choice but to dismiss him for breaking protocol so publicly and dramatically. But, as he looked into Lucy's shining eyes, he realized he didn't care about the consequences. For the first time in his adult life, he had chosen connection over protection, humanity over duty. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd, her heart racing with fear for her daughter's safety and awe at her courage. "Lucy," she called, reaching the barrier just as security guards arrived at the scene. But Lucy wasn't finished. With the wisdom that sometimes emerges from innocence, she turned to face the crowd of tourists and, in her halting but determined voice, said, "He is good man. He helps. No hurt him." The simple words, spoken with such conviction by a child who struggled to communicate, had an electrifying effect on everyone present. The teenagers who had been harassing James looked genuinely ashamed. The elderly tourists who had criticized the guard's distance began to reconsider their assumptions. Even the security personnel seemed uncertain about how to handle a situation where a disabled child was defending a guard who had clearly responded to her with kindness. One of the security officers, a man in his 50s who had worked at the palace for over a decade, approached James with an expression that mixed official concern with personal understanding. "Captain Morrison," he said quietly, "you'll need to come with me." James nodded, understanding that his moment of human connection would come with professional consequences. But, as he prepared to leave his post, something unexpected happened. The crowd of tourists, inspired by Lucy's courage and moved by what they had witnessed, began to applaud. It started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but quickly spread through the entire gathering. They were applauding not just the guard's moment of kindness, but the little girl's extraordinary courage in defending someone she saw as worthy of protection and friendship. As James walked away from his post for the final time, he carried with him not shame or regret, but a profound sense of gratitude. The little girl's silent plea had indeed reached him, and his reaction had broken every rule he had lived by for decades. But, in breaking those rules, he had discovered something far more valuable than professional advancement or institutional approval. He had rediscovered his own humanity, and, in doing so, had given a little girl who struggled to be heard one of the most powerful voices she would ever possess. The disciplinary hearing took place 3 days after the incident at Buckingham Palace. James Morrison sat in the sterile conference room, facing a panel of senior officers who held his career in their hands. Major Richardson sat to his left, his expression carefully neutral, while across the table, Colonel Hartwell reviewed the file that would determine James's future in the Queen's Guard. "Captain Morrison," Colonel Hartwell began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "you understand why you're here. Breaking protocol in such a public manner, especially during a period of heightened scrutiny regarding guard public interactions, represents a serious breach of duty." James nodded, his hands folded calmly in his lap. The last 3 days had been a period of reflection unlike anything he had experienced in his adult life. He had spent hours walking through London, thinking about the path that had led him to this moment and the choices that lay ahead. However, the colonel continued, the circumstances of this incident are unusual. We've received over 300 letters and emails from members of the public who witnessed the event or heard about it through news coverage. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Major Richardson shifted uncomfortably. The viral video of Lucy defending James had sparked an international conversation about the humanity of ceremonial guards and the importance of connection across barriers. News outlets from around the world had picked up the story,
praising both the child's courage and the guard's compassionate response. The palace press office reports that public opinion has shifted dramatically, Colonel Hartwell explained. Rather than criticism about guards being too distant, we're now receiving praise for their humanity and dedication. The incident has actually enhanced public perception of the guard. James remained silent, knowing that institutional approval, while significant, wasn't the real measure of what had happened between him and Lucy. The little girl had given him something far more valuable than public relations success. She had reminded him of who he was beneath the uniform. Nevertheless, the colonel continued, rules exist for important reasons. We cannot simply ignore protocol violations, regardless of their ultimate consequences. The question before us is how to respond to an act that was simultaneously a breach of duty and an expression of the highest ideals of service. The hearing continued for another hour, with testimonials from witnesses, reviews of James's exemplary service record, and discussions about precedent and institutional integrity. Throughout it all, James found his thoughts returning to the little girl who had somehow seen through 23 years of carefully constructed professional distance to recognize the person he had forgotten he could be. Meanwhile, in Manchester, the Chen family was dealing with their own aftermath from the extraordinary events in London. Lucy had become something of a local celebrity, with neighbors and school officials reaching out to praise her courage in defending the guard. More importantly, the incident had sparked conversations about communication and courage that were having profound effects on her daily life. Sarah Chen sat in the office of Lucy's speech therapist, discussing changes they had observed since the trip to London. It's remarkable, the therapist explained. Lucy's willingness to attempt verbal communication has increased dramatically. She seems to have gained confidence in her ability to be heard and understood. The impact went beyond speech therapy. At school, Lucy's classmates had heard about her adventure in London, and their perception of her had shifted from seeing her as the quiet, different girl to recognizing her as someone capable of extraordinary courage. Teachers reported that she was participating more in class activities and seemed more confident in social interactions. But, perhaps the most significant change was in Lucy herself. The experience of successfully defending someone she cared about had awakened something powerful in her young spirit. She had learned that her voice, however limited, could make a difference when used to protect and support others. Back in London, James's hearing concluded with an outcome that surprised everyone involved. Colonel Hartwell delivered the panel's decision with the gravity such moments demanded. Captain Morrison, after careful consideration of all factors, this panel has reached a decision. Your violation of protocol was clear and undeniable. However, the circumstances were exceptional, and your response demonstrated the highest values of service and humanity. You will receive a formal reprimand that will become part of your permanent record. Additionally, you are being reassigned to a new position within the royal household. James felt his breath catch. He had expected dismissal, not reassignment. The Palace Education Department has requested your transfer to their Public Engagement Division, the colonel explained. Your experience with protocol and your demonstrated ability to connect with the public make you an ideal candidate for their new community outreach program. You'll be working with schools and youth organizations, helping children understand the history and significance of royal traditions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The incident that had violated traditional protocol was now opening doors to a role that specifically valued human connection and educational engagement. 3 weeks later, James found himself standing in front of a classroom of 8-year-olds in Manchester, wearing civilian clothes for the first time in decades. The teacher had arranged this special visit as part of their unit on British history and traditions. James carried with him a collection of photographs, artifacts, and stories designed to bring the history of the monarchy to life for young minds. As he scanned the eager faces in the classroom, his eyes stopped on a familiar figure in the third row. Lucy Chen sat with her hands folded on her desk, her eyes bright with recognition and something that looked like pride. Today, James began, addressing the entire class but speaking directly to Lucy. I want to tell you about the importance of traditions, but also about how sometimes the most important thing we can do is remember the people behind those traditions. Lucy's teacher had briefed James about her communication challenges, but, as the presentation continued, he watched her gradually overcome her usual hesitancy.
When he asked for questions, Lucy's hand shot up with determination.
"You remember me," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the classroom. "I do," James replied, kneeling down to her level in a gesture that echoed their first meaningful interaction.
"You taught me something very important that day in London.
You taught me that sometimes the greatest courage comes from seeing people as they really are, not as what they appear to be." The classroom fell quiet as the other children sensed the significance of this exchange. Lucy reached into her desk and pulled out a new drawing, one she had been working on since hearing about James's visit to their school. This drawing was different from all the others. It showed James not in his guard uniform, but in civilian clothes, standing in front of a group of children. All the children in the drawing were raising their hands, eager to participate and learn. At the bottom, in her increasingly confident handwriting, Lucy had written, "Mr. James helps children learn." As she handed him the drawing, Lucy spoke again, her words clear and purposeful.
"You help now in new way."
James accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. In that simple artwork, the little girl had captured the transformation that her courage had made possible. She had seen not just who he was, but who he could become. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to a very brave little girl who taught me that helping people means seeing them as friends, not just doing a job." The rest of the classroom session flew by, with James sharing stories about royal history, traditions, and the importance of service. But the real education was happening in the connection between a former guard who had rediscovered his humanity and a little girl who had learned that her voice, however different, could change lives. After class, as the other children filed out for recess, Lucy approached James one final time. This time, instead of a drawing, she offered something even more precious, a confident smile and words spoken with newfound clarity. "You kept promise," she said, referring to the silent commitment he had made that day at the palace to honor her trust. "You are still good man, still my friend." James knelt down and, with permission from her parents who had come to observe the class, gave Lucy a gentle hug. "And you are the bravest person I've ever met," he told her. "You changed my whole life by seeing something good in me when I had forgotten it was there." As he prepared to leave the school, James reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. A little girl's silent plea had indeed reached him across all the barriers of duty, protocol, and emotional protection he had constructed around himself. His reaction had broken every rule he had lived by for decades. But, in breaking those rules, he had discovered something infinitely more valuable than career advancement or institutional approval. He had found his true calling, not as a silent guardian of tradition, but as someone who could bridge the gap between history and humanity, helping children understand that behind every uniform, every ceremony, every tradition, there are real people with real hearts. The former Queen's Guard and the little girl who couldn't speak had together found their voices, and, in doing so, had created a friendship that transcended every barrier the world had placed between them. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures of courage, and sometimes the most important rules to break are the ones that prevent us from seeing each other as fully human. Lucy Chen had taught James Morrison that true service isn't about maintaining perfect distance, but about building perfect connection. And James had taught Lucy that her voice, however different, however difficult, was powerful enough to change lives and break down walls that seemed unbreakable. Their story became a reminder that courage comes in many forms, that communication transcends words, and that sometimes the most important friendships are forged between the most unlikely people in the most unexpected circumstances. The little girl's silent plea had not just reached a royal guard, it had transformed two lives and created ripples of understanding that would continue to spread far beyond their first meeting at the gates of Buckingham Palace.